Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. So welcome to this Climate Registry Pavilion event, Pathways to 1.5 degrees. And today we're going to be talking about pathways to offshore wind acceleration in the Americas. I'm Becky Drake. I'm the offshore wind digital lead at Arup. Arup's a global collective of designers, engineers, and sustainable consultants, and we focus all of our energy on sustainable development and shaping a better world. And as part of that, we have a strategic focus on the energy transition and offshore wind's role in that, in helping us reach net zero. And this panel session is all going to be focused on discussion around decarbonizing the grid, and really getting into some of the details around what the opportunities are, what the barriers might be to investment in the grid, and building into that picture details around regulatory aspects as well, and how that might differ between, for example, the US and the UK, and some comparisons across different countries there. So I'm joined this evening by my panel, and I'll introduce them briefly and then let them introduce themselves in more detail. So we have over here to my left, G. van Nieuwenhove from SVP National Grid Ventures. And then we have Alice Reynolds from the California Public Utilities Commission. And we have Knut Vrålstad, who is the head of strategic and market analysis at Aker Horizons. So G, over to you first to introduce yourself.
Hello, yep. Thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to be here today, this panel. So, G. van Nieuwenhove from National Grid. National Grid is a large sort of network business. It operates in UK and US. We've got electricity transmission and electricity distribution in the UK, as well as interconnection between the UK and European countries, the likes of France, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, and we are building one to Denmark. In the US, we've got our service territories in New York and in Massachusetts, in New England. And we also have some developments on onshore solar, and recently, through a partnership with RWE, also in offshore wind. Reason why I'm very excited to be here today. So, additional to offshore wind, we also have the new ventures, which is sort of the less regulated business, and it basically focuses on new markets and new technologies. So we're looking at things like hydrogen, CCUS, etc. So we're really looking at the full energy transition, not just offshore wind.
Yep, over to you, Alice.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much to Arup for putting this panel together. I am really excited to be here. There is a lot of energy and momentum around offshore wind in California, so this is really great timing for this panel. And so Alice Reynolds, I'm the president of the California Public Utilities Commission. We regulate the investor-owned utilities in California, including energy utilities, electricity, and gas. And a large part of that is driving toward the transformation of the energy sector to clean energy for all Californians. On offshore wind, we have been watching carefully as other nations and the East Coast states have moved forward with offshore wind development. Our situation in California is a little bit different than some places, in particular in the East Coast. We have a steep drop off in our intercontinental shelf, so we need floating platforms in California. It's a little bit harder than places than like our East Coast partners, and we We also have really great wind in California, and the studies have shown that it will complement our intermittent renewables very well. So our large fleet of solar resources and our onshore resources. But the best places in California for wind are Northern California and the Central Coast, and those are not our big load centers. So we'll be looking at a need to study, design, and upgrade, perhaps build new transmission lines. So that's part of the planning that we need to do as we move forward on our offshore wind aspirations.
Excellent, thank you. And I think, yeah, we'll definitely come back to that difference between the East and West Coast later on as well. Go on, Knut.
Okay, hello, and thank you for the invitation to come here to this panel today. I'm Knut Vrålstad, head of strategic market analysis in Aker Horizons. Aker Horizons is a company that does planet positive investments. So that includes ownership and project development in areas such as clean hydrogen, carbon capture, and in this case, most notably, renewable energy. So Aker is a very old industrial undertaking, industrial company from Norway, with a very long and proud tradition in the maritime sector, underpinning the Norwegian oil and gas sectors. And the Norwegian coast is also very, with a very steep drop-off, and therefore floating installations has for a long time been the name of the game in off the shore of Norway. So we've developed, I think 60% of, or the Aker group has developed 60% of the current offshore energy installations in the world. And so that is a backdrop to an undertaking to go into offshore, floating offshore wind through our company, Aker Offshore Wind, who is then has been developing projects in various countries in the world, in South Korea, Japan, Norway, UK. So we are developing these projects, and also the US, by the way, and looking most notably then lately to California to develop that. On top of this, we have been instrumental in developing 2 pilots for floating offshore wind in off the coast of Portugal and off the coast of Scotland. And those are some of the largest offshore wind installations currently operating. So we're early to the game there. On top of that, we are the majority owner of Mainstream, which has now merged together with Aker Offshore Wind to create a powerful industrial push for both generally renewables, but in particular floating offshore wind. And Mainstream has also a very proud tradition of developing offshore wind installations in the UK. I think 20% of the offshore wind fleet under construction or in production today has been developed and consented by Mainstream. Yeah, so that's a little bit of my background here.
Thank you very much, Knut. And now, in terms of the first question, I'm really interested to get your thoughts on what you think the biggest barriers are to offshore wind development in the US, and particularly accelerating offshore wind development from where it is now, given some of the really ambitious, rightly ambitious targets. So I'm going to come first to G, and then we'll come to Alice, and then back to Knut on that one.
Thank you. So let me first give a little context. One of the businesses that we have is a partnership, a JV with RWE. So basically developing offshore wind in New York, in the New York Bight. That's between sort of Long Island and New Jersey. So just to give you a sense of scale, the seabed can host about sort of 3 gigawatts of offshore wind. So that's sort of just over 1 million homes that can be powered in the US. So significant, and it's been named community offshore wind because we also see the focus and the need to obviously focus on the communities, but effectively by developing cleaner jobs and growing the regional local economy. So when we think about sort of developing this opportunity, I think there are a few important things to highlight. The first one is supply chain. I think it'd be good to hear from you, obviously, if you have any perspective on that. But we think that we really need policy that will help develop the supply chain over time. The scale, obviously, is quite significant in the US in terms of ambitions. And it's very different than in the UK because, for example, in the UK, you've got access to the European supply chain that the offshore wind industry is a little bit more mature. So that supply chain is there in a way. Whereas in the US, we see that there is a significant level of investment that is needed. There is still a lot of things happening, very positive, some state sort of level sort of coordination that is really helping. And we also see that, of course, the bills that have been passed, the infrastructure bill and the IRA, I think these are sort of significant incentives to keep developing the supply chain, not only from an investment perspective in terms of incentives for the production, manufacturing, but also the supporting infrastructure. When we think about supply chain, it's quite a broad sort of concept. So we see that IRA will really help that supporting infrastructure, all the vessels that are needed to be built over time. The second thing that we think is really important, and I would say is a barrier, is also an opportunity. It's the transmission planning. So I think there's some sort of grid limitations. So obviously the closer you are to the coast, the weaker the infrastructure is. So when you're thinking about this size of offshore wind being integrated and connected, of course that will put a lot of congestion, a lot of reinforcement requirements towards the coastal area. And the biggest demand is towards sort of the inshore. So effectively, we see the need of that onshore reinforcement to move that energy inland. And then finally, within that, I would think that there is some physical constraints, right? So as we think about connecting offshore wind to the shore, I mean, there will be some, ecology or like real, existing infrastructure, shipping lanes. So there's some practical, physical considerations to think about, and the landing points, the communities, etc. So I think those are the main ones that we can think of.
Thanks, G. And I think particularly on the transmission infrastructure, it'd be really good to delve a bit more over the course of the rest of our discussion this evening into any regional differences. So differences, Alice, that you already touched on in terms of California state around where the best resource or generation locations might be versus where the demand sites are. And does that differ at all between East and West coasts and the complexities that brings? But Alice, get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, great. And as I talk about the challenges, I'm also going to talk about where we are now on offshore wind and kind of how we got here. And because I don't want to sound like there's so many barriers that we can't get over them. So, talking about our path to overcome the barriers that we see. So in California, when we started looking at offshore wind, we had to consider first our sea space. I already talked a little bit about the areas where we've seen that our wind is the strongest and can provide a good resource. So in those areas in the Central Coast and the North Coast, we have marine protected areas and we have interests of the Department of Defense. And so and we also have visual impacts with our iconic beaches in California and people visiting the beach and wanting to make sure that they still get the pleasure and the same experience in the beach. So in design and thinking about locating offshore wind turbines far enough offshore and then avoiding some of the areas that we needed to work around. We've spent several years working with the federal government and many other stakeholders to develop lease areas off the coast. And we successfully identified 2 call areas with our Federal Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM. And we are now looking forward to a lease sale on December 6th. So that's very exciting, our first lease sale. We see that as just the start in California. And at the same time, we concurrently have been implementing a state law which directed the energy agencies to set planning goals. And so we just concluded a process to set a near-term planning goal of 3 to 5 gigawatts by 2030, and then a longer-term planning goal of 25 gigawatts by 2045. So that, those aren't, mandates, but they really set where the direction we want to head to provide some framework. It's like, let's get started with these lease areas, but we really see larger potential off the coast. And at the same time, we see that potential fitting in well with what we know, the growth that we need in our energy system. Based on projections of electrification and also the need to transition from our fossil fuel resources, we anticipate that we may be doubling the needs of our current resources by 2030. And so just looking at that, at 2030 or 2045, depending on how quickly we can move. So we have the need, we have the start of areas, and we have strong wind resources. So really we see it as a good fit. I talked a little bit about the floating platforms, but as we're seeing in Norway, the technology is there. The other challenge, though, is in procurement. So in California, we have, within the service territory of our 3 large investor-owned utilities, we have over 40 retail sellers, so over 40 load-serving entities. Procurement is being done by all of these entities, and they've been moving forward, doing some joint procurement, but to a large part, they've been doing it individually in small chunks. So we're looking for a way and exploring now a way to have the large need that we see for procurement of offshore wind matched with the needs of our load-serving entities. And so we are looking at a central procurement option. It's something that we're studying at the PUC. And we'll look forward to seeing that progress in 2023, and we expect to be making some decisions about how we might get an entity in place or a combination of entities or one of our investor-owned utilities situated to do the procurement so that financing can then move forward from there for the developers. So that will be a really big hurdle that we need to overcome, but something that will be important. And we do see a pathway to get there. We're also, I mentioned transmission a little bit earlier. So we're doing studies of transmission, including study of what it would look like to bring our North Coast offshore wind up through Oregon and then back down into California. Studies are going on for that route concurrently with work from our independent system operator, who's doing a sensitivity analysis study on over 10 gigawatts of offshore wind that we have sent over to them. So kind of assuming that we get over 10 gigawatts, what would it look like from a transmission perspective? So that is not the plan that the independent system operator develops that then leads to the direct authorization of the transmission. It's the first step. It's a sensitivity analysis that will inform the next phase of the PUC process, and then hopefully lead to the plan that can be implemented by CAISO and developers. So those are the main things. We also see supply chain challenges that we'll need to work through, and then port space and port development. We have invested through our state budget funds to do a study of the port of Humboldt and how we can make that a staging area. And this is, of course, an opportunity for jobs. And, we have lots of interest in our just transition work for new employment in California. We want these jobs in California. We don't want to see the ports go to Oregon or Washington. We want to have the hub for this development here in California. North Coast is a possibility. We're also hearing now that with these, the aspiration that we have, we may need to have 2 port developments. So expect one in the north, and then one around the Central Coast or even LA. And so lots of exploration there, and need to think about the space for the large turbines and the infrastructure to have in place. But so luckily, through the budget last year, we've made a down payment on doing some of the studies and work that we need to do moving forward. I guess the final point I'll make is on the environmental analysis and permitting. So we've learned a lot from European countries and the East Coast on impacts to marine resources, impacts to wildlife, impacts to the coast. But there's further study needed for that in California. And we have many permitting agencies that will be looking at the development when it goes forward. But as a state, we have also been planning coordination of that permitting work so that it goes more smoothly, and we're kind of providing a glide path to the developers as they go through our permitting agencies.
Fantastic. You've given us quite the collection there, and I'm very pleased to say,
I told you it's a lot, yeah.
As someone who's based in the UK, it's I guess reassuring that all the points you raised there and all the conversations we're still having in the UK about forward direction and in UK and Northern Europe, and what the challenges are, and sort of the transmission network infrastructure, and looking at sensitivities around that and investment into that, how that's balanced with regulation, which is something I really want to come back onto in a minute. Ports and supply chain and jobs for the just transition. It's all the same conversations. So hopefully there's a lot of knowledge sharing and lessons learned that can be passed backwards and forwards there. So I'm going to come on to Knut for you to share your thoughts as well before we go back to the transmission investment topic.
Thank you. Yes, well, it's a lot has been said already, but I just want to say how kind of reassuring, as you said, it is to listen to you, Alice, and see what's been done, and kind of it all starts with the planning phase and the ambition. So industry is very comforted when they see the ambition. So that's a really important first step. And then it's all about, doing the consenting and permitting and all that. So those things need to be to come in line. And I think the fact that you're doing all the stakeholder management, which is really important, you have to get everybody along. And I would like to add also to engage also with the industry, because it's not just about how you plan it from the regulatory point of view. It's also what types of developments that industry can bring and the innovation that also industry can bring to solve those types of questions. But back to the original question, I asked our US teams kind of what are the main challenges, and they came back and said, okay, these are challenges, but they're also opportunities, given the fact that there's such a drive for development of the offshore wind in the US. So, but they are top of the list where port upgrades, which you already mentioned. So that's really important to deploy these solutions offshore. You need deep sea ports. You need good capacity there. Then there's the domestic supply chain, already mentioned, needs to be ramped up. As you said, in Europe, we've got a leg up on the US there, but with the Inflation Reduction Act and all those kind of things being put in place there, incentives to do just those developments, I think you're kind of on a good first step there. And then linked to that is also kind of the domestic workforce development. You need specialists. You need those that type of workshop. And then lastly, which I guess is maybe the main point of this exercise, is the grid modernization, as it's called. Not necessarily building kind of monster masts and these things that might be difficult to develop, but just as much just getting the maximum out of the existing grid and finding good solutions to develop the grid. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that tees us up nicely to where I would like to take the conversation now, which is around taking perhaps some of the lessons learned from what's happened in the UK over the last decades, and the fact that our grid development and investment and innovation in the grid is fairly restricted by our regulatory and policy processes. And so it's been developed on a just-in-time basis. And so I'd like to kind of turn to each of you and get your thoughts on what do you think within the current policy and regulatory context in the US and the ambition for innovation and potential for investment in the transmission infrastructure and the grid, and Alice, studies like the sensitivity study you referred to, how could that be brought together, and what do you think is the forward direction of that at the moment? And hopefully there can be some lessons learned from the UK and how things will hopefully improve and could have been done better, but you know, restrictions led to where we are now.
Tim, I'm well happy. Yes. So if I just go back to this interconnection, I think there's a lot of learnings in terms of the UK interconnection with the European countries. So you basically have got the UK connected to France, as I said, Belgium, sort of Netherlands, Norway, and now we're building the Denmark. And when you think about if you imagine that sort of North Sea, we've got all this interconnection happening between countries, which provides a huge amount of flow of green electricity in both directions. So it also provides a great opportunity to enhance the security of supply, which is critical today. But then you've got all these huge ambitions also set in the Northeast, and everyone is sort of trying to develop and build the offshore sort of capacity in the same place. So you've got all these crossing lines visually, if you can imagine. And then the biggest opportunity there is to actually increase the utilization of those interconnections by linking the offshore wind. So the way we're thinking about this is that effectively over time, what you could see is the offshore wind connected to this interconnection between countries, maximizing utilization, and over time become more like energy islands, mesh grids, and then incorporating other technologies, you know, like even hydrogen, you can have localized production offshore and then sort of bring broad. So there's a huge universe of opportunities out there. So when we think about that, I think the learning is that you really want to make sure that those ambitions that are set very early on, they capture the future state, and that in a way that allows for even a degree of anticipatory investment, right? Because there's still technologies that are not there. There are things that we don't know exactly how they're going to look like, but we do know that we will need certain things like sort of infrastructure grid enhancement, different grids ready to manage a very different type of load, et cetera, and even capacity. So those are I would say, one of the things that if I was to bring some of the learnings from UK and Europe, I would hope that as you design the future in the West or East, is that you really think about that future state, take the risk of the anticipatory investment, and prepare your network for the future.
Go on, Alice. Hoping that you're going to be able to come in a little bit with the regulatory context and what that enables and supports, or any challenges around that.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm thinking about kind of translating your lessons learned to the way that we're thinking about this in California, and it is very relevant. And I think one aspect of this that's important is that we're moving forward on offshore wind in the context of larger development of resources. So for us, it's about diversity of resources. We know we're going to need more solar. We know we're going to need more onshore wind. We certainly are going to need a lot of storage, both lithium ion storage and long duration storage. And so all of those things, geothermal, so all of the resources that we're exploring are going to be needed for our future grid. We also need to make the grid smarter. And so we're looking at load flexibility very, very seriously. And so, you know, with the intermittent resource, we already have a large solar fleet in California. And so our demand response programs are maturing. They're getting stronger and stronger. And we're hoping to incorporate them with the electrification work that we're doing with the increase in electric vehicles, increase in heat pumps in homes and businesses, so that we'll really be flexing our load at the same time that we're adding resources, and of course in a seamless way to the consumer, as everything will be programmed. So the vision of, you know, the smart grid, increased resources, and with offshore wind being one of them. You mentioned just-in-time planning, and so in California, we have, for the first time, our independent system operator did a 20-year outlook. They're normally on a 10-year cycle, but they, you know, recognizing that we need to plan ahead, we need to start now for these long lead time projects.
they have created this outlook, 20-year outlook. And so we're using that as part of our planning. And we're now in the process of thinking about what next steps to follow on that, and how to get the transmission identified in a way that is that provides more lead time for the resources. At the same time, we're also looking at near-term resources and increasing both transmission upgrades that can be done fairly quickly or already in the process, and getting projects online. In the past 2 years, we added about 10 gigawatts of nameplate capacity, which, you know, is pretty extraordinary. It's I think a record, and close to a record in California. During the era time, we did a lot of development, but that's a big number for California. And I think notably it includes 4,400 megawatts of battery storage. And so, and that has really been working with our grid very well. So we're kind of learning learning as we go, and recognizing, as I said earlier, that offshore wind is a great complement to that diversity of resources. At the same time, there's a lot we don't know about the future. And so we're planning for a future that is not quite defined. But what we want to do is make sure there's space and a path for developers in offshore wind in particular.
That's great. And it really does sound, from a California perspective, like you are really thinking forward and trying to plan for a future, even if you don't know what that is. I don't know whether, Alice, this is something that you can touch on, but whether that differs to other states and differs between East Coast and West Coast at all. And are you seeing any differences there, or fairly forward thinking across the US?
Well, I think one difference is what I mentioned earlier, is just the disaggregation of our load serving entities. And I think sometimes it's easier if you just have 2 or 3, or if you have vertically integrated utilities, which we don't have in California, except for some of our smaller public utilities. But for the investor-owned utilities, none of them are vertically integrated. And so we have to plan for the development through these 40+ load serving entities, and through contracts driven by the private sector. Of course, you know, lots of competition there, lots of developer interest. But at the same time, we have to work with our investor-owned utilities on the distribution and transmission system, which they, of course, control, and making sure that they're working on interconnections. And we have been, in the past few years, really focused on transmission level interconnections, the need to get new projects online. And now we're seeing a growing need for distribution level interconnection work, and the acceleration of that, to make sure that we're, as our load increases, that we're able to have the distribution system ready to recognize that load. We also have a lot of distributed energy resources that's leading to needs for distribution system upgrades. And, you know, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is cost. So certainly a challenge. All of those things I just mentioned have a cost. And so for offshore wind, we're thinking about, you know, how can we make sure that we're controlling cost as much as possible. And part of that through permitting, if we can expedite, if we can facilitate permitting, does that keep some costs down? Certainly through competition, certainly through economies of scale. And, you know, the fact that we've seen Europe and the East Coast go before us, and it bring some of these technologies to commercial scale has been helpful.
Brilliant. And you've come on to the next point that I was wanting to talk about, which is costs, really key. So perhaps, you know, I'm sure you had some thoughts on that one too, but if we come to you as well on how you think we can accelerate offshore wind development or deployment in the US, but at the same time minimizing costs and costs to end consumers as well, particularly within the kind of the economic context we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah. So the current situation is very special, but I think we can safely kind of plan through that and get into more normal state of affairs later on. And I think that, as we've seen with other renewable technologies, which has really cut costs, it's all about giving the regulatory and policy and basically the financeability of projects through a phase which is the startup of a supply chain development in the US, and also profiting from the global efforts to cut costs and to scale up this industry. so it's kind of both focusing on establishing that supply chain and the workforce in the US, but also staying open to the competition and global innovation, which is really coming now. We see that offshore wind is having a lot of very good headwinds, not just in the US, but basically in most of the markets that we're seeing, such as South Korea, Japan, and Europe, not least. So being open to that and letting the industry do their work, but providing them with some kind of reliability through these kind of 2030, 2035, 2040 targets, and then OREX or some other type of system that remunerates the necessary kind of additional costs, which is needed in this starting phase of offshore wind. Yeah.
And Knut, coming to you straight away again, but I wonder if you can share some thoughts on cost reduction and cost reduction pathways for floating offshore wind, particularly in a global context, but also bearing in mind the context of California and the fact that that will be predominantly or entirely floating offshore wind.
Yeah, and we're happy to also prove it to you through a concession in the upcoming auction. But yes, I think that the important thing about floating offshore is that to some extent it's can be scaled easier because each individual installation is more similar to another one than bottom fixed, which is ultimately you have to kind of cater for the different topography of the ground and things like that. So there's a definite kind of scalability factor, which is really important for offshore. So that's why you know the first rule of the game of getting costs down is scale. So therefore, if you want to develop scale on the west coast, you must also rely on not just California, but other neighboring states, and really get that going. But of course, and then there's some things that are different and not necessarily that you can't carry across from other geographies. So in Norway, we have really deep fjords. That means that we can choose types of installations that are deeper and yeah. So which not necessarily is possible to transfer to other geographies. So there's a bit of catering to the local conditions along the west coast or the east coast, and then there's a bit of being able to profit from that global scale up of offshore wind, yes, and floating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really key point that you touched on there, and other panelists have touched on already, in terms of supply chain and job creation, and that, the just transition and skills transition perhaps as part of that. And I think that scaling up of particularly floating offshore wind manufacturing in the States is a really interesting area to talk about it, both in terms of how can we accelerate cost reductions, but at the same time also lead to job creation and local community buy-in in that. So Alice and G, would you like to come in on any thoughts on that?
Yes, let me just first reflect a little bit on the cost, and then I'll share some thoughts on the workforce development. Because I think they're linked actually in many ways. I mean, the workforce development is basically a key enabler, without which obviously you wouldn't be able to deliver any of these commitments. As I think in terms of cost, the way we are thinking about it is, I mean, scale is really important, but it's also important to find ways of collaborating. I mean, a lot of the synergies will come from technologies, from sharing knowledge and learning from other geographies. So all these really good examples that you were given, I mean, it's really through these conversations that cost that would ultimately benefit consumers, customers, is that they can be achieved. So I think collaboration and sharing knowledge is at the heart of that cost reduction sort of pathway. In terms of workforce development, well, there's a lot of things that can be done. I mean, the global and local workforce development, I mean, it's going to be critical to deliver on the global ambitions of offshore wind. So when I think about what could be beneficial or what could work in, I think in the US, particularly sort of the Northeast, I think it's really thinking about at the federal level, you know, like at the highest level, how can we find certifications or certain level of training, that apprenticeship programs that can help people transition from other industries into the cleaner sort of offshore wind industry. That's the first one. And then secondly, finding a level of certification that would allow people to move across states as well, so that it's not state specific. The development and the pace at which offshore wind will be developed, offshore, onshore, will really sort of change by state. US is huge, and I always remind people it's very different than UK. You know, like UK can be just one single state, and the US is just enormous. So I think that's really important. Then another dimension that we think about is filling the union roles with diverse talent. We've got our own sort of national grid training programs where we give priority to disadvantaged youth. So I think that's also really important that we think about diversity as we develop our workforce sort of plans. At a state level, I think it's really down to communities and sort of the reach out to I don't know, vocational, you know, sort of initiatives or agencies, local colleges, community colleges. So I think it is really about sort of, I mean, it will be very different by region and by community. So, and then sort of finally, I think what is really important is that we as organizations, we all, I mean, role model diversity, you know. I mean, we, National Grid, we now have a chief diversity officer that works globally across all business units. And it really helped shift the culture, you know, like the awareness, the learning. And it's amazing how quickly we've seen a huge advance in terms of our journey to deliver sort of our diversity programs. We now have, for example, a commitment to deliver 50% of diversity by 2025 on both our senior leadership and our talent programs. So we're very encouraged about that, and we think that that will really shift the dial when we get to the transition for offshore wind skills as well.
Alice, would you like to come in on that as well?
Sure. So a lot has been said. I guess one thing I'll add is that we're thinking about maximizing leveraging of state and federal funding that's available, and so that means, you know, some of the things that we've already been talking about, both in terms of workforce development programs. So we are investing state funds in workforce development, and we're making sure that those are really targeted towards clean energy. Climate overall, but in particular clean energy. Lots of good jobs there, lots of jobs to help us with our transition away from fossil fuels. California is still an oil producing state. We have refineries, we have, you know, a lot of employment surrounding the fossil fuel industry still. We want to make sure those jobs transition to not necessarily the workers, because this is going to be a long journey that we're going to take. So we don't want to, you know, take anyone's job away, but it's more that as we develop that pipeline, we want to have apprenticeship programs. We want to build our union labor in clean energy jobs. And we're really well on our way of doing that, but we're trying to accelerate it. We're trying to ramp up any spending that we can for workforce development. And then, of course, there's the IRA and the IIJA, and so federal funding that we're tracking. We're trying to maximize that money coming to California compared to other states. And have, you know, kind of plug and play programs ready to receive federal money when it's available. And a lot of that will be focused on the offshore wind industry. And to the extent we can do some of the manufacturing in state and do all of the steps from start to finish in offshore wind, including building the projects with California labor. That's where we want to go. And so some of that, you know, hopefully can help with the overall driving costs down while also building jobs in California and using our funding to complement and support. I mentioned permitting as well. That's another thing that we're trying to both plan for and provide funding for. Our budget investments have included funding for permitting to try to make sure that goes quickly, but also that it gets some financial support from the state. So really looking at all of the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And go back to a previous comment I made earlier, a huge number of parallels with Northern Europe, UK there as well. I think an interesting point, G, that you raised there as potentially a challenge that's more unique to the US than perhaps across the water is that kind of difference in certification across states, and with the kind of the need to grow the workforce so substantially and to enable the kind of the current oil and gas workforce to make that transition as well. Is there anything happening in that space at a federal level to support or enable cross certification or a move in that?
I know that I don't know and specifically to offshore wind, but we do have, and I think part of the concern in California is that for people, it's a big state. You know, our state is big enough to kind of, you know, we have 40 million people. 40 million people is a lot of jobs. So we tend to like and support California workers. We also have stringent labor standards, and so to the extent that, you know, where projects are located in Nevada or in other states because of cheaper labor, that's not something that is helpful to California necessarily, although we certainly share workers across state lines in Nevada and Oregon and our other neighboring states. I think that, yeah, I mean, I think basically just that a lot of our workforce comes from California, is in California, and we're big enough to support the labor in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And apologies for pitching a question you might not have known the answer to. So something that I'd like to go on from there is, so that we've been talking a lot about workforce and the just transition. So what else do you think is needed from a broader just transition perspective, and also to take consumers on the journey with you through this energy transition? Do you want to come in on that, Knut, first?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that just transition is a lot to do with workforce, and there I also want to emphasize that it's not just the construction which is important, because in construction ultimately is done in a 3 years period, and then of course you're going to ramp up to many gigawatts, but still that will be gone, whereas O&M workforce is there for 30 years and plus. So I think that it's important to think, when you think about the workforce and the impact of longer duration, it's a lot more to do with the O&M part of the workforce. So yeah.
I guess I'll add that I think the question is broad enough to mention community benefits, and that we're thinking a lot about the communities surrounding these projects, and certainly the ones that are impacted by projects. And even with the lease sale, we have a component for community benefits in the lease sale, but we would also look to expand that moving forward and really explore, partly through the permitting process, environmental review, but also just in working with stakeholders, how to get benefits into communities. This is something that I've been interested in talking to our colleagues overseas who are working on this, as well as the East Coast. And we have had conversations with New York and other East Coast states as they think about communities and how to develop some meaningful community benefits along with offshore wind development. So it's something that we don't quite have figured out in California. But we are continuing the conversation on it, and we would be developing those ideas together with the full range of stakeholders, meaning, members of communities surrounding these projects. We have tribal governments in the areas of the offshore wind projects. We have fishery interests, and so really getting a large table of folks to talk about how to achieve community benefits as we're moving forward with the projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, finding a solution that works well for everyone is a very tough challenge, and ones that are successful with that too. I mean, I think we have, you know, examples from UK and Northern Europe where the community benefits have ended up going into funding football clubs, and maybe that's, you know, a benefit to the community, but actually where we can more directly relate the benefits to lower energy bills for communities, even though these are kind of national or state level assets and they're feeding into the grid at that level, really supports both that kind of taking the consumers on that journey and benefiting local communities really relevantly in relation to their energy use and their energy bills. G, did you want to come in on that one as well?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with all of what has been said. I think we think about communities as perhaps really broadly and very early on in the process. So we see that as such a critical path. I mean, I just given the examples of interconnection and sort of linking the offshore wind assets, but in a way, you know what, all of that started sort of the other way around. It didn't start with the synergies and the cost synergies of actually bringing those assets together. It started by looking at the landing points, which I think Alice already made an earlier point, and realizing that if we're going to be deliver the ambition in a radial connection way, I mean, it means that we're going to be talking to hundreds of communities across the coastal. And we then found that we're doing these other connections, which had a different purpose. And it all started by actually thinking about the communities that we were affecting. So it's quite interesting how we landed there. So early engagement, really listening. Each community is different, even across a coastline is very different. Some are highly sort of dense populations, some are affecting port areas, some of them are affecting industrial areas. So really thinking about what is really going to change for those communities. So we spend a lot of time listening as much as we go and talk to them. And the other thing is they need to trust who is going to be doing all of this work. And that's our challenge, right? And we take that very seriously. So we need to give them some level of assurance that all this work, all these initiatives will look and they will deliver the benefits that we are describing early on. So I think that's also really important. And then finally, when we think about sort of training programs and whether they are state level or whether we think that can be done even nationally, we also think about more of a wraparound service, so something that will make sure that those potential candidates will have final access to the opportunity, right? So we always worry that sort of just by doing the training, you know, just by having the training certification, that in itself doesn't quite give you the sort of the leap or the step into the new opportunities. So we've been thinking about how do we support the public and sort of the local organizations to help them really transition from existing industries into sort of offshore wind, cleaner, greener jobs.
Brilliant, thank you. And time really does fly when you're having some great conversation. I feel like we're only just getting started, but we're coming near to the end of the hour. So one of the things that I'd like to ask all of you is, given the current context of where we are in the US at the moment and the ambition to decarbonize the grid, what would be the two things that you would change right now? Do you want to go first?
I think the first one for me that is the most important is collaboration. I think we've seen that here at COP, and I really welcome that. I think the share of technology, sharing sort of a knowledge, experiences, what worked, what hasn't, I think that's critical, and I think that will be the biggest difference. I think the second one we touched on throughout the panel today, is really enhancing the network, the grid. I think that's where we see the biggest sort of bottleneck. So everything that we can do to really help advance and reinforce the grid to allow all of that offshore wind, renewable electricity, not just offshore wind, but all the different type of technologies that are needed to deliver the energy transition, that will be critical. So that'll be my two: collaboration first, as always, and reinforcing the grid.
So just on the point of collaboration there, if I can come in and ask you a point of detail, what would be the thing that you would like to see changed to enable more collaboration?
I think that the energy transition is really complex, is monumental, and I think people tend to think about collaboration mainly across the private sector. So the one thing that has worked quite well in the UK is the collaboration between private and public sector. It's really sitting around the table together, co-developing, co-creating, and really shaping the policies together. I think that would be something that it exists today, but I will obviously think that we need to take it to the next level.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll let Alice come in now.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people would answer that question by mentioning things they want to change about their regulators. And so since I am the regulator, I'm not going to say anything that needs to be changed about the PUC. So I guess the two that I will pick would be to essentially go forward in time and have the technology of offshore wind be truly to commercial scale, to have it, to see it come down in price the way we saw solar come down. So it would be to take us from now and move us forward into the future and see those price declines that we know are going to come in the future, but we're not quite there yet. The second one is similar, that I'd like to see a way to really get to just transition. We talk about it a lot, but I think it's really hard when you have, folks who are working for industries that we see as needing to transition out of. So fossil fuel industry, it's their job. They maybe have a pension fund. It's what they do. And we're telling them that they have to really get a new way of life. We don't have a good way to handle that, except to say that the change is going to be slow and that, there are exciting new opportunities. But it's very, very difficult. So I guess I would change kind of, the being able to speak to those people and provide comfort and provide a real path and financial security for our workers that need to transition.
Brilliant, thank you. Knut, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I also had grid on my notebook here as one of those two items that really, I think, needs to change and evolve, especially on the West Coast, probably. And we talked a lot about that, so I'll leave it alone. But the second thing, maybe a little bit from my perspective, as I went through the New York Bight auction from BOEM, and looking at the kind of the crazy levels of lease prices that were offered there, and then just looking at that, what is that system? Ultimately, it's the ratepayers that pay, and there's a system where leases are really pricey going to the federal level. So I don't know. I'm not an American. I wouldn't know, but that seems to me to be contrary to a good development, because acceptability among the ratepayers to have a large share of offshore wind is going to be hurt by them having to pay those extra dollars on the bill. So maybe that, from me as an external, would be something that I would change. Yeah.
Alice, would you like to come in on that one until I could see you pondering that?
Yeah. That's a good one. Somehow, if we could, pick a winner, a lease sale winner, but then have the federal government lease for $1, if we could manage to make that change, that would be fantastic.
And sorry, just because this is a very important issue also in Europe, because we've seen that these auctions, it's a very different setup, but still you have competitive auctions for leases. That means that it really puts pressure on the whole supply chain, because there are not so many qualitative criteria, so it becomes really competitive. And even with zero bids on the subsidy, and that means that you don't get those co-benefits of the development of the supply chain, of the good jobs domestically and local content and all of that. So I think that especially in the start of the floating wind era in the world and in the US. Qualitative criteria must have a higher kind of ponderage in those decisions. So that's, yeah, that would be my wish for a change. Yeah.
And I would have to completely agree with that one. Although I think, you know, the competitive auction process has done a huge amount to support driving down costs to see offshore wind where it is now, and able to be a really credible and dominant part of our future low carbon, green renewables. But I think absolutely those qualitative factors need to be built in earlier as well. Absolutely, Jean, do you want to come in on that?
I think it's a very good point. The latest solicitations or RFPs that we've seen, actually they're shifting a lot of the weight already. So I would say that it might not be perfect, but it's certainly shifting. So I think that must be a clear signal, a recognition that the people really value the other aspects, as you talked about, more the qualitative aspects, and also the community. You'll be surprised how much weight there is today from our experience of what we've seen in the Northeast, how much weight and real expectations there are in terms of the thought and the leadership that we'll be playing with communities. So it's not surprised that we name ourselves Community Offshore Wind. We know that is at the heart of who not only we are, but who we need to be.
Brilliant. And as we're now wrapping up the session, I'd like to come back to you all very quickly for your last thoughts on what you're most excited about. So, Knut, do you want to go first?
My kids, but apart from that, I think that we're really at the beginning. I think today there was the first power was delivered from a new Hywind Tampen, which is a floating offshore wind development. It's going to be the largest offshore floating development when it's ready, which is early next year, I think, when it's all completed. So I think that we're really at the cusp of a very exciting development for floating offshore wind, and we're very excited about being a part of that. Yeah.
Over to Alice.
Well, I guess in addition to just being excited about offshore wind in general, it's new for us. It's, you know, it's clean. It's doesn't involve some of the land use issues that we have for other projects, and it potentially could be a large amount of power to supply. So in addition to that, just kind of going broad, this is what it's all about, right? We're cleaning up the electricity and the supply, and then that is going to power everything in our state, essentially. So that fundamentally is very exciting.
And for me, just to build on that, on those two, I think my excitement is how much I've seen in the last year in terms of shift to execution. I've got the benefit of looking at sort of UK and US sort of investments and how we allocate capital. And I would say that a year ago, UK and Europe had a lot of the policy quite well advanced, and you would have said that that's a more mature place to deploy capital. There's some recent announcements that has made a very healthy tension across Atlantic, and I think that healthy tension is needed to keep pace and keep momentum. So that keeps me really, really excited to see that everyone is really sort of moving the post, and I think that can only bring better benefits.
Absolutely. And I think for me, where my excitement lies is the fact that we currently have 58 gigawatts of offshore wind installed globally, and the ambitions, you know, we heard it in terms of California looking longer term to 25 gigawatts, looking at the US targets, and globally out to 2050 is all the way up to 1,000 gigawatts, if not more. So that makes me really excited, and us working collaboratively together on how to really accelerate scaling offshore wind is going to be absolutely key to us delivering against those targets, and offshore wind really reaching its potential in us getting to net zero. So with that, I want to say thank you to my panelists, so to G, Alice and Knut. Thanks very much.
Thank you.